good morning and grand rising to you all. Happy Monday to you guys. If you guys are just tuning in, thank you for tuning in and welcome to another episode of the Grief Let's Talk About It podcast. You guys know who it is. This is Tony, and I am the host of this podcast. And as always, this is our way of normalizing conversations around death, dying, and grief, trauma, suicides, all of those different things to help you find the resources and the support that you need. But also being able to relate to these stories is a great way to develop those tools to help you get through those hard times. Now, before we get started and I bring on my next guest, if this is your first time tuning in, do me a favor, head over to their YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell notification so you'll be notified every time that we drop a new episode. And yes, please check out in the corner. I have a new logo. Thanks to my friend Rachel. She's doing good work, and you guys are going to see a lot more work from her. And as always, this is for educational purposes only. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section. We'll be sure to answer those as we go along. And as always, I'm going to be bringing up my guests. You guys, please get your pens and pads ready. Have those questions ready. And we are live across a bunch of different platforms. So whatever platform you guys are tuning in on, please put those questions up there. We got you. Now, without further ado, here bringing on my next guest, Samantha Pickering. Samantha, welcome to the show.
Hello, Tony. Great to see you.
Hey, same here, same here. Now, before we get started, tell people who you are, where you're from, and about the work that you do.
Well, my name's Samantha Pickering, and the first thing I want to say to everybody is that I'm a Veloma, and I'm not sure if that's a word necessarily people have come across before. We all know the word, if you lose both of your parents, you become an orphan. We also know if you lose a husband or wife, you become a widow or widower. In the whole world, there is only one word that covers parents that have lost a child, and that's a Sanskrit word, which is against the natural order, Veloma. So I am a Veloma, and I know, Tony, you are a Veloma too, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, we both joined a club that we didn't ask to be a part of, you know.
Exactly, and that's another huge part about it. Velomas never choose to be Velomas. It's something that's thrust on us, and it sends us into a spiral that we never expect, because the loss of a child is against the natural order of everything we've been taught from a very, very young age. We know in time our parents, grandparents, pets, etc. will die in a set order. Our children are never part of that equation. So when you suddenly find yourself in the world of a Veloma, it can be very frightening. It can be hugely disconnecting from any other reality that you're aware of. It can feel incredibly isolating from all those around you, but it doesn't have to be the destruction of you. And I think as much as it's not a club any parent ever wants to belong to, there is a huge connection with inside the Velomas that are out there of just such love and passion for the children that we love, that are no longer here, but that we still care for so deeply. And they're children worth talking about too. Just because our children have wings, it doesn't mean that we should stop having to talk about them. Yes, I appreciate that can feel uncomfortable to people, but it's really uncomfortable, drowningly, suffocatingly so, if we don't get a chance to talk about them. So I am a Veloma. I open it up to any other Velomas out there to say hello and even mention your child's name. I'd like to get to know them. I'd like us to get to know each other and see how far we can take this talk and this discussion about child loss into the world, because it is still very, very sadly a taboo subject that if we never talk about it, how are we going to know that when we, or if we need it, how are we going to know what support's out there? And if we don't need it ourselves, how are we going to ever talk to people that we know that are suddenly affected by this loss?
Very true, very true. And you know, when we talk about the topic of child loss, it is very painful to even imagine losing your child, you know, because when we have our children, they're such precious gifts to us. that we begin to plan out the rest of our lives, right? What
Yeah.
sort of parents are we going to be? You know, and we oftentimes laugh at the challenges that comes along with children growing up. Getting into the pots and pans, and saying how are we going to dress them, right? What sort of schools they're going to go to, the friends, what sort of friends are they going to make? But most of all, we love their character, the characteristics and things like that. And it's a whole lot of things that we add in. The hardest thing that we do is imagine a world without them. And unfortunately, it does happen.
It
And
does.
when we enter into this realm of child loss, we realize that it's a lot bigger of a group than we ever wanted to imagine. And they're the people that are right in front of you. They're the people that are sitting next to you at in the buildings, going to get groceries, etc. We never really take that into consideration. So my question, well, let's talk about your journey um, with your child.
Okay. Um, for me, the loss of my son happened very suddenly, and loss of a child can happen in so many different ways, and each way it occurs can bring its own challenges. Um, but in my instance, my son went to bed happy, normal, fit, healthy 15-year-old. And the following morning, I went to wake him for school. Unfortunately, he wouldn't wake up and had actually been dead a long time by that stage. He had a sudden brain aneurysm overnight. An added complication for me was that I'm actually a mum with 5 living daughters as well. So I'm a mum of 6. I am incredibly, incredibly blessed and hugely grateful for that. But it did mean at the point that I discovered my son was dead, I couldn't even do that primeval scream. You know, the one they show on all the movies? That
Mm-hmm.
absolute huge expanse of emotion that is really needed in that moment. But because I'm also a mum of living children, that had to be contained to protect the living. And part of my journey has been, how do I manage my grief? How do I connect to my son who's no longer here? But how do I also help support my living children? My children were 18 months, 3 years, 17 years, 19 years, and my 20-year-old who was living away from home at the time. So that's a huge expanse of ages. Each age has their different response to grief as well.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody taught me how to deal with my own grief, let alone my children's grief.
Right.
And it was just through my work on trying to support them and trying to support myself, I realized how little this discussion of child loss has had, how often people say to you, how are you? But actually they don't want to know the answer. Or if you start trying to tell them, they just close the conversation down rapidly, because a lot of people can't handle the reality of how scary this grief can get.
Right.
But if we'd spoken about it before, if there was a more open discussion of what it's like to be a bereaved parent, then there would be more ways that people knew to talk to us, and the simple things that could support us in the early stages when we don't even know who we are anymore, or what we like, what we don't like, or where we begin in the world again.
Yeah. One of the biggest things, and I want to get your thoughts on this, was how do you separate the two, having living children and trying to comfort them all the while dealing with the new reality that has just transpired, right? And all the things that come along with that, the people leaving you, the people saying crazy stuff to you. How do you find the strength to comfort your living children after that loss? Because they also are experiencing it and they're dealing with it in their own way. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'll be honest, there were times, Tony, where I didn't think I would be able to make it. I didn't think I could manage the burden of all the different ways people grieved. And I mean, at first I kind of stupidly thought grief was grief and we all did it the same way. We went through this tick box of a few emotions and out the other side and away we went. And actually, I think I was still stuck in the old belief that once the funeral is over, that's it.
Right.
That's only the beginning when it comes to child loss. Up until the funeral, I was so busy trying to manage this whirlwind that had hit my house that I couldn't even begin to start processing any of the loss. Right. I needed that time once the funeral was done and things started to calm down. But that's the time when other people tend to go away. And that's also the time that you need the most support, particularly when you've got young children as well, because they puddle jump in and out of grief, which I hadn't realised. Their brains aren't designed to take grief in the same way an adult can. So we can take in what we think is the enormity of it. They can only take in small segments. Right. And a prime example of that was my daughter, my 3-year-old, would be happy, playing, going to the park, walking along merrily, and then go up to a stranger and say, "My brother's dead, you know." And that look of shock and horror on a person's face when my daughter said that. And all I could do as her mum was to say, "Look, she needs to tell you this. This is the truth of what's happening in her life. Yes, my son has just died. Please let her tell you what she needs to say." In some ways, I guess I'm almost grateful for my daughter being as brutally honest as a 3-year-old is, because she was in the moment, she said what was on her mind, and she then just went off to the next thing. Maybe if I hadn't had her saying that, I might have held back from discussing this with the person in front of me, but she'd thrown us into the conversation, so there it started, and we just had to take things from that point. When somebody dies at home suddenly overnight, younger children become very petrified of going to sleep, so a lot of time was spent trying to manage that fear, and it's an understandable fear. They've lost somebody who's fit and healthy, who went to bed and didn't wake up. Although we explained again and again that it was my son's brain that had catastrophically gone wrong, it's still taken a long time for them to understand that. My oldest one wanted to bottle up the whole thing. She was away because it was COVID lockdowns. Mm-hmm. She hadn't been in the house for a while and she didn't see it happening. So her defense was, "I'll box that and I'll put it away to deal with another day." And we have to wait. And when she's ready, that box will be brought down and I'll be there with her.
Right.
Another one of my daughters couldn't handle it and was actually suicidal herself, which, you've just lost one child and suddenly having another suicidal child. I mean, my son, he didn't die from suicide. I have seen in myself how when something extreme happens in life, how easy it is to get to that stage and how much help is needed to bring back. So I was having to be there for my daughter and help her when I was falling to pieces. And then another daughter was falling out with the one that was in the state she was in, because that was her brother and she was closest. So there was a lot of different things, different techniques for each child, and I had to learn them myself in the first instance. The gut instinct from me as a mum was meet the basic needs, make sure everybody's got food, we get out and about into nature, and we start connecting to just the simple things around us, not having to rush and do this, do that, and do everything else. We don't have to go at the pace of the rest of the world. We need time to create some solid foundations, the foundations that protect our needs and find out what our new needs are before we try to rush any further. And if a need for one child was connection, but human connection didn't work, then it was a case of looking at animal connection and taking them to situations where they could connect with wildlife or farm animals or even dogs, to have another avenue of support that they could lean on. So some of the work for me has been delegating as well, trying to work out. I'm the project manager of chaos at this stage. Yeah. How do I begin?
Yes. You said something, and I think a lot of people don't really understand it until it's put in their face, how quickly it goes from one moment to the next, right? And how fast it progresses. You can have one child that is going through it, and you turn your head and you got another child that's looking to take their life. And even as parents, right? We go through these things, and I want to say that, or I don't want to say or assume anything, but it's the fear. It's the fear of losing another one. Yeah. And that I have to say, when I became a bereaved parent or a Veloma, it was so hard for me to go around other people's children's afterwards, especially their friends. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really take a lot of things into consideration, like what was his friends going through, those other children, what was their parents experiencing from watching their children go through this. And and I meant no disrespect when these things were when it had happened. I just knew at that moment it was hard. It was so hard for me to go around them and look at their faces.
Yeah.
Or either being around other parents, because I was thinking to myself, like, what did I do to deserve this? There was a lot of blame that came along with this, and that dark place that came along with the blame, like the woulda, coulda, shoulda, the what ifs, things like that. Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And any parent out there that's listening right now that have lost a child, they know exactly, and the fighting with your constant self, the new identity, the grievance of the old identity.
That fear to step away from who you were before and step away from that raw intensity of the grief as well, because what kind of parent am I if I stop crying and actually try to find a way to live with this? I would say to anybody that's at that stage, actually, when you let it go, when you relax and stop being fearful of your grief, it changes from being in front of you as a beast that you can't escape from, to moving to one side, to being a companion and actually a connection to your lost child. So now you'll know where I'm coming from, Tony, but I can honestly say I love my grief. It is not in front of me, stopping me and blocking me from the world. It is here. I've given my grief almost the voice of my son, and it says, next time a grief wave comes, it's almost as if my son's turning around to me going, Mum, stop. You've done too much for everybody else or whatever else you're doing. You're not paying attention to yourself. Stop. This grief wave is to remind you, I'm watching over you, and I'm going to make sure you behave yourself and actually do what you need for yourself, to protect yourself, to preserve yourself, to support yourself, and to allow yourself to grow. So don't get me wrong, grief waves are hard and they can be painful. But actually, I think in some ways, I almost needed the brutality of that to stop me in my tracks. Because otherwise, with juggling everything else, it's far too easy for me to get lost in the helping my children, helping those around me, and forget to put on my own oxygen mask first.
Yes. I love that you said that, but I want to add to that as well, because those grief waves or the grief hurricane, those grief storms, they come in, and a lot of people forget to breathe.
Yes.
They forget to breathe. Now they're not going to be like you and I. You
No.
know, we embraced it and we fell in love with grief. You know,
But that
and I
took time, Tony. That
took
didn't
a lot
happen
of time.
straight away.
Yeah, and
And
that's
that
what I
took
was
a
going
lot.
to add to right there. It takes time to be able to do that, and everybody's going to process and develop in their own way. They're not necessarily going to fall into the same field that we got into and see the gifts that was given to us, right?
Yeah.
It takes a different person to want to jump into this thing and be like, you know what, I really like this right here, and I could take the things that I've gone through to be able to serve and be of service to others that are going through similar things. But I tell you what, that's a fight that I don't wish on no one.
No.
You know, I really don't. I don't wish that fight on no one for the simple fact of I often, I was sitting around this morning, yesterday and this morning, thinking about these things because I was getting ready for my social media post and things like that, and I was pondering this thing, and I just the approach that I'm going to take of it, and I got to going. You know what? The fight that comes not only with the new reality that you have just now been tossed into with no form of guidance or rules or regulations because there's no book on it.
No.
But here's the thing, and I want to get your thoughts on this. The conventional way or the conventional stages of grief that was written, I found that it didn't it didn't follow any sort of pattern. And I realized that there was more to it than just the five stages, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, and I think nowadays when we think about it, right, there's over 40 some different stages of grief.
There's so much that goes into grief, and even just an element of anger, that emotion of anger, you can break that into so many
Yeah,
individual nuances that track back to various different things that have happened in your past as well, which is why everybody's journey through grief is so nuanced as to how it's experienced. But it's trying to work out what bits can be done by everybody in those early stages of grief just to keep your head above water when you don't think you're going to. And I found every time a grief wave or grief storm hit me, going back to some basic grief first aid has been a stabilizing force, and going, you know what, I do actually have to stop at this point, and that's okay. Allowing myself to be okay, to be with my grief, and allow myself to stop because my grief needs me to do this at that point.
yeah,
To not be afraid of the emotions, to let myself breathe, not, oh my God, it's coming again. To hold onto my heart and my stomach and just breathe deeply, and even say my son's name out. Or it doesn't, for me, my deepest grief is the loss of my son.
right.
But that's not necessarily the only time. Just holding yourself and breathing and saying the loved one's name out loud is going to be beneficial, because one of the worst things I found with grief is people stop talking about my son, and not hearing their name and not having a situation where I could use his name anymore was another factor that puts more pressure on you. And grief waves will come up the longer you are suppressing the emotions that are there, any emotions, and the longer other people have put different ideas on as well. It's got to come up again and
Right.
again and again.
Oh, it's a forever thing, right?
Yeah.
And I look at things from both sections as well. The people walking on eggshells around us, afraid that it's going to
They
bring
don't want
up.
to make us cry.
Right. They don't want to make us cry, not understanding that we're going to do it anyway. And for the very longest time, for a very long time, and even now, um, I often find that people tiptoe around me, especially when it comes down to them talking about their children,
Mhm.
and me having to go, man, it's okay.
Yeah.
Like I had to tell a friend of mine because he was afraid to bring his son around, and I've known his son since he was a kid, and he was around when I had my son as well.
Hmm.
And he used to always tell me, man, he would want to talk about his son and about the things that were going up, and then he would watch me and go, "Oh man, I'm so sorry." I go, "No, you don't understand. To me, your kid is my niece or nephew, and I've always looked at other people's children that way."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, I didn't want to make you cry or or anything like that." I said, "Look, the biggest thing that you can do is don't stop being a father.
Yeah.
Don't
You're
ever."
right. You do not stop being a parent at all. And you need those normal conversations, don't you?
Right.
But the normal conversations, we need them to talk about their children, but allow us, without shock and horror, to add in conversations about our
Mhm.
child as well. So they might say, "Oh, our child did this," and you go, "Oh, I remember when." And what you don't want at that point is them to go, "Oh my God, they've started
Right.
talking about."
Yeah.
You
Because
just need that natural flow that we knew before our child had died.
exactly.
But in the process of their death is sadly far too frequently cut off. We lose, if it's the school gate, we lose the connection of those at the school gate. If they work playgroups, we lose those connections. We lose connections of clubs and activities or hobbies that the children got up to, unless somebody is prepared to join us in the dance of talking both ways about the living and dead.
I love that you said that, right? Because I often related the beginning after my son passed away, like it was like a foxtrot. It was very fast. It was a lot of movement going on, and there was just so much I didn't understand. Nowadays, I relate it to like a waltz, right? It's a perfect waltz.
Mhm.
It went from fast paced to slowing down to where it became this beautiful symphony. And to be able to dance along with the waves of grief, but to also incorporate other people into this dance that we have, to let them know that this is something normal. And
Yeah.
although we tell ourselves that this is out of place, you and I have talked about this, and when I say this, it gets a lot of people. Look, there's nothing that says that we're exempt from this. Nothing at all. That is the harsh reality.
Yeah.
That is the harsh reality um, that we all must face. And again, I don't wish this on no one. I wish everybody to have a fulfilled life with their children, to be able to give them everything that your heart desires, to experience this world and be fulfilled and be happy. That's what I wish for everyone. But if they do so to have to be included in this club that we have, I wish that they find individuals like yourself and other bereaved parents out there to be able to go and have that support. To be able to connect with those other parents out there to have guidance, but also have people to walk with them and sit with them in the hardest moments, and not to feel afraid. Um, how your grief makes someone else feels uncomfortable. Because I have had people. I had a guy tell me one time in the beginning it was too much for him, and I thought to myself like, too much for you.
Yes. Yes. It's
Okay, you know,
and it's far too much for us, but we don't have the choice of being able to walk
right,
away from it.
right,
Unfortunately, we have to. It's, when people say to you, "Oh, how do you get out of bed each day?" I don't think I could do it. So I'm not any greater person or stronger person because I get out of bed. It's just there isn't another satisfactory choice. You need to get up out of bed and put one foot in front of the other. Having guidance, having connection of other bereaved parents, and having support from somebody who knows the darkness, who can sit with you in those dark places and be that light for you, showing you ways that you could choose to navigate out to find the path that's right for you, is important. That's part of the work that I've gone on to do. So I retrained as a life coach and grief educator with David Kessler, and started doing grief movement as well, because I needed an activity that was, particularly the grief movement, something that I could do and do around my young children without having to explain what I was doing, without having to use too many words, and without having to scare them. But that could actually seem quite good fun to them, so they could get involved with it as well, without them realizing just what emotions they were connecting to, processing and releasing. So
I got a question, because I know how I got into this field, right? The darkness I had to go through. Um, when was your deciding factor? What was the things that led you into getting to um, becoming a life coach and grief educator? What was that defining moment where you said, you know what, this is it?
I definitely got into that darkness and couldn't see a way out of it. Didn't have the strength in myself to reach out to organizations that were around, or when I did finally muster enough strength, a lot of those, I discovered such thing as the wrong form of death, to be able to access different organizations, which was wrong postcode, wrong form of death, wrong age for the person that's died. And each of those kept knocking me back into the hole. And maybe I've got a stubborn streak to me, I'm not sure. But after a number of setbacks of trying to find something and it not being there, I thought, I'm going to have to build my own ladder out of here. And somebody said to me, what were you like as a teenager? What sparked your interest growing up? And one of the things I did like doing was learning. I'm not good at reading. I'm not particularly brilliant at writing. I am dyslexic and ADHD. Well, hey, maybe that's why I found another way to get out of this. I don't know. But the thought of turning around to books, just reading other people's stories, wasn't necessarily going to work for me. But to learn how to do something that could help somebody else seemed a good way for Samantha, the mum, to find a way to support her children. And once I'd found a way to do that, I picked up along the way how to support me too.
Okay.
So that's where it took me. But also a very kind friend sent me just a little box after my son died, and it had a set of pajamas that were secondhand, but it didn't matter. It had a drink, a candle, something to cuddle, and I think a picture, or just a couple of small items that were all linked to just bringing me comfort in that darkest moment. And I have to say, it was the most beautiful gift for me to receive, because it sat there until I was ready to open it. And when it seemed like everything else was vanishing and people were walking away from me because they couldn't manage my grief, that box was still there, ready for me. And it just contained it. The contents didn't necessarily matter. It was the fact that they connected me to my senses, and they connected me back to who I was.
Okay.
And in that, I got a lot of support. And I've actually gone on and I've created a little box, Tony, that has something similar. I won't explain all the details, but it's just little boxes that have those connections to your senses and to the season that you're in within grief at that stage. And something that just sits to one side and gives you a little bit of information, a little bit of hope, and a stepping stone that will build season by season to just give you some strength to get out of that hole.
I love
because
that.
That's what I needed.
And I'm going to ask about that as we get, before we jump off because I want people to know, you know what I'm saying? Because do you sell those, or is it on your website and everything?
It is on my website, yes.
Okay, I'll make sure that people have that information because that is very valuable. That is very valuable information, especially when you think about the seasons of grief, right? Here's one thing that I really wish that I really like to inform people, especially the men that I talk with. The seasons of grief is a real thing. Every season is going to bring another layer to what you're experiencing, because the weather can be gloomy out, and that can affect your mentality going through. You know, I've struggled. The one thing that I've always struggled with is understanding the mental aspect that came along with it. I no longer struggle with it now. Now I embrace it and I jump into it. I'm still
Mhm.
learning, of course. I learn in order to be a teacher, to be able to articulate, to be able to help guide those men through it, but also to be able to talk in a more articulated way when it comes down to appealing to the masculine nature.
Yes.
You know, and again, this is the lane that has chosen me, and I walk it with grace, hopefully, and do my best to become better, but also understand how to help others,
Yeah.
to be able to find that balance and grace within those seasons. Since you've been in this field, what is one of the biggest challenges um, that you have experienced as becoming a grief educator and a life coach? How do you combine that, and what's the biggest challenge?
Um, how do I combine it? Life coach is about taking a person in the moment that they're at, finding out what their biggest issues are at that stage. You look briefly back to where it came from to try to understand some of the early patterning that might have occurred. But the main focus is then, okay, so this is it. What support do we now need, and how do we go forward?
Okay.
And I liked that. I tried counselling for myself, but a lot of it seemed to be stuck back here when I wanted to know, this has already happened and I can't change the fact my son is dead. I would desperately do anything to change that,
Right.
but I can't. And what I need to know is not everything that's ever happened before. I need to know how I pick up the pieces and start moving in this direction. So the life coaching element helped, but that wasn't set for a grief environment. So it had some aspects of it that were not set for a person who was grieving. And I needed to find some way of being able to talk to people where they were in their grief and have that awareness of the nuances that each different grief brought and the complications that could come up and potential ways that you could discuss that and look at ways to find support in that. So that's why, for me, having the combination of both really worked. But then equally to have grief movement for the times when you just can't talk, because sometimes the emotions get too much and the weight of the emotions means you can't find your words. And for me, emotion requires motion to move it on. So anything, I have a disability myself, so I can't get out and do long runs or long bike rides, the really active things that I wanted to do, that I can't go and beat 7 bells out of somebody in a boxing match to release the anger. I had to find other ways of doing it. And the grief movement gave me that aspect. So it was just tying in the bits that I needed and pulling from different avenues that were out there to work on a combination that worked for me and is of help to other people. And it won't be right for everybody, and that's absolutely fine. But at least it's something to look at and consider. But I'm so pleased that you brought up from the male side of things that men experience the seasons too. It's not just a female woo-woo thing. It's our bodies are set to respond to the seasons accordingly. And in that response, there comes the emotions as well.
Right. Well, the one thing about understanding how men and women grieve, you first have to understand the similarities that we share in our grief journey. We just may express them a little bit differently, and in some cases a lot more differently. You just have to understand the language, right? But to understand, what are the common things that we share? The seasons of grief, the emotional aspect that comes along with it, the basic things, the anger, the depression, the anxiety, the irrational thoughts, the trust issues, the vulnerability, but also the internal fight, not just the spiritual, emotional, but the physical fight that comes along with that. But the hardest one that we experience is the mental fight that comes along with it. And what I mean by that, we're constantly thinking about the next person. How are you thinking about? What are you thinking about me at this moment? Are you calling me a failure? Are you calling me weak? Are you calling me, whatever it is, whatever those things go? This is shared across both across both sides.
Mm.
The thoughts about how our friends perceives us, the relationships that we had that have now changed, the the way we view other people and their children, right? You know, the trust that comes along with that, the lack
Yeah.
of trust,
The lack of trust, yes.
and these things are common across the board. So, having that understanding opens up the doors for us to be able to connect in that different area. The biggest challenge that I found was that we don't see them, and then we begin to push and poke and prod instead of having grace and patience with each other as we begin to explore um, those things. But also, learning, here's where the biggest challenge between the both is that just because I often tell this to everyone, just because you're ready to talk about it doesn't mean that I'm ready to talk about it. And just because I'm ready to talk about it doesn't mean that you're ready to talk about it. Sometimes it's okay to have that separation, to go and get, as I like to say, go get your shit together. Right? You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Get this stuff, get your shit together. And then when you're ready, not anytime soon, be able to create the atmosphere, right? Create the atmosphere. You want that person to be able to talk. This is common across both sides.
Yeah.
And here's where the struggle lies: the atmosphere. A lot of people don't understand that. If you create the atmosphere to be able to talk, it allows the conversation to flow. But also understanding, if you see one person pushing back or pulling back, then it's okay to take a breather and step off and go, we can continue this whenever you get ready, right?
Yeah.
And not rush the process, because it is a unfamiliar territory on both ends.
Yes.
And
I can absolutely agree with that. There's no point me trying to have a discussion with my husband about the loss of my son when he's in the middle of an Xbox game. That is not the time. That is not the right atmosphere. I cannot expect him to put pause onto that game and have this heart-wrenching discussion just because I've discovered some part that I really need to understand or that I really want to share with him. That is not the time.
Yes. And you have to look at how men and women view the world as well, right? And I'm glad that you brought up the Xbox, because it is funny, because a lot of times when men, we go out and do things like, I don't know, playing Xbox or going out and working on a vehicle or going out and doing lawn work, and things like that, especially in the midst of the deepness of that loss. A lot of times men are just trying to think about the rational part of it without, this is how we single out. We can be focused on the game, but deep in thought about, about what's going on. And we try to make sense of the emotional aspect because we're not taught to be emotional. We're taught to be providers and protectors, and things like that. So this is and unfortunately, I'm about to give away a huge secret. This is my way of protecting you from the demons that I'm fighting.
Yeah.
And that can hit pretty deep for a lot of people because this is the part that no one wants to talk about. Life
But we all need those avenues, don't we? We need something that we can zone out into while our mind makes sense or tries to process the whirlwind that's going on.
Exactly.
And we need to know that that's their avenue. That's what they're doing. This is not the time to interrupt that. It might not look for the other person as if they're doing anything useful, that it's processing it in any way, but we've actually got to step back and know that's their way. That's okay. We need to let them do that.
Well, let's add to that as well, right? Because you're not wrong. You're absolutely right. But let's add another layer to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is my way of protecting myself.
Yeah.
Right. This is and it's common. It's common across across the platform. This is my way of protecting myself because, for one, and protecting you, right? Because if I'm focused on this right here, and you leave me alone and let me think about this and be rational, in the grand scheme of things, I won't be able to checkmate you. Because you got to remember, when I'm in this frame of thought, I am playing chess with myself. I'm playing chess with the world. Whereas this is the common thing. Most men will play chess. Most women play checkers. So if you come in thinking that you're going to hop, skip, and jump me, try to crown me and everything, I'm going to push everything into your way because these are my pawns for me to protect myself. And a lot of people don't understand that aspect of it, and so when you look at it from that point of view, you have to know what game you're playing. You have to know, because if not, that grief game it can be like Rubik's Cube, and every time you try to switch it around and everything, you never get the colors and everything lined up. And
that's why so many people separate, isn't it? Because they just can't see that they're talking from different spectrums. They're talking about the same grief, but from totally different angles, and they're totally different ways of responding and protecting themselves and making sense of it all.
Exactly. And that's where the communication and the support comes in. And this is why I'm such a strong proponent of, hey, women, go surround yourself with other women that understand what you're going through so you can learn how to navigate this world, but also have that support. Because just like and you've heard me say this before, just like iron sharpens iron, women sharpen women, men sharpen men. It's important for us as individuals to be around those who have gone through similar things, to learn, to be supported, to feel comfortable, and vulnerable, to be able to talk. Because when you can release that, and I can now come to you and be in a space to where I'm not as aggressive as I would normally be. Right? You know what I'm saying? And because when I do that, you're going to take it the wrong way, and it's going to become a fight, and we're not going to get to a place of acknowledgement of those two worlds. And so it's constantly the biggest challenge is the blame game, and that can come very quickly as well, because it only takes one thing to be said and then one person be offensive and go, well, if it wasn't for you, that my child would still be here, because now you individualize such a shared experience. You're like, oh, it's my son or my child, etc., and which makes that other person feel, then what am I? I'm chopped liver. I was there too. Right, and I know this because I've had to do this before. I've had to fight that battle, and I always looked at it and I knew what it was. It was the other person taking jabs at me because they knew that that was the one thing that I cared about more than anything in this world was
It's
my
often easier to take a jab at
right,
somebody else, blame somebody else, than sit in the harsh reality that you spoke about very early on, that
mm,
sadly this can happen to anybody at any time. We don't have a magic wand. If only our children had stopped child death,
mm,
we would both sit back and go, it's awful what we're going through. But if it stops anybody else ever having to lose their child, then we will manage this. The reality is, it hasn't stopped anything.
no,
And people don't like sitting in that scary space where we just don't know. Death can happen to anybody at whatever time it happens.
very true, very very true. I you know I want to dive deeper into it, but I want to do it at another time where we can have like, what I'm saying, and talk about the stages of grief and come at it from different areas, right? And be able to
You
unpack.
mean I can come back again,
Oh,
Tony?
come on now, you already know, what I'm saying? I would love that, but I would leave that up to you to go whenever you get ready. Let's set up some time to be able to do it. But I want before I let you go,
Mhm.
tell people where they can find you. You also got, you know what? I'm going to get on your case as soon as we get off because you forgot to do something. And yes, I'm pointing my finger at you right now through the camera.
You can point your fingers at me, but I'm going to point it back and say I was actually very good this weekend and I took the weekend off for my grief.
Okay,
Regardless of
okay,
anything
okay.
else, I went away to a grief retreat that was going on in my area just to sit with my emotions, because when I'm around my children all the time, I can't always do everything I need to do. So I took the intentional action of going by myself to something to sit with my son's memory. So I got a weekend with my son. I'm very grateful. But no, I didn't do my homework for you. I'm sorry, Tony. I
No,
will.
no, yeah, you did do your homework for me, so I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that. Right? I'm so glad that you took time to do that. You can always send that stuff over because I would like to get that into the description so people know where to find you and
Yes.
everything else. But while you're here, how can people find you?
So my business is Veloma Solace. So it's velomasolace.com. And as I said, Veloma means that against the natural order. And solace is just that most beautiful word for being there and supporting people. I'm not here to tell you how to grieve, how to do things. I'm just here to hold that space with ideas and that light in the darkness so that if you need it, you know there's someone you can turn to who's been there, who's walked these footpaths before you, who's seen how dark it can get, and who isn't afraid to sit in that darkness with you and shine that light to help you find your next steps forward.
Yeah.
And the other element is the griefsupportbox.com, which is for the boxes because they're available for bereaved parents, but also for somebody else who's lost any relative. I found when my son died, people gave me bunches of flowers. And as somebody who was bereaved, the last thing I wanted to see was a set of flowers sat on the side, gradually dying away. I found that really heartbreaking. If it was potted plants, that was fine. That still had life to it. But to watch these flowers wither away was too much for me at that stage. So I wanted to create something that was a different gift that you could give to anybody that you knew who'd lost a family member. You send the box to them, you get an email saying, here's some ideas of how to talk to them based around this box. So you know how to start the conversations with somebody who's grieving. And it's not the, how are you today? Start of the conversation.
Yeah,
It's conversations that really begin a flow.
I love that. I definitely love that. Um, if you can leave the audience with something right now, and before I say this, I want to say thank you to everybody on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube for tuning in today. Thank you guys for just for just the support, being a part of this conversation and everything. And hopefully, you guys didn't put any questions up there, so I can only imagine you just sitting back and just watching and enjoying the conversation. Thank you guys for that. So now, before I let you go, Samantha, if you could leave the audience with something, what would you leave them with?
There is nothing wrong in the way that you're grieving. But if you're finding it too heavy and you think you can't go any further, do reach out for help. You are never going to be grieving for too long or in the wrong way. And it is never a wrong time to talk about a child or a loved one that's passed away. I want to help you find your voice and give you that power in yourself to go, it's okay to talk about people that we've loved and lost.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. Wow, such a deep thought. Thank you. And now, with that being said, I want to say, because people somehow, I wasn't intending on, what I'm saying, people jump, scheduling and afterwards, but they scheduled, and I was like, oh, okay. So, but it's all good though. It's definitely all good. I appreciate everybody who wants to come on and be on the show. And so, you and I, the invitation is there. And I would love to have you come back so we can dive deeper into the mind of the grieving process for bereaved parents,
Right.
and dive deeper into the meaning of Paloma and how that associates itself with us. To find that deeper meaning within the solace, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a huge topic that we could talk about, and I'm going to get your thoughts on that afterwards. And with that being said, everyone, this is going to conclude this episode of the Grief Let's Talk About It podcast. If you're just now tuning in and you would like to hear the full episode, please go to the YouTube channel and tell us your thoughts on there. But also, let us know what you think. And if you have any topics or anything that you would love to see us talk about, remember, we have a lot of guests coming on and things like that. So you guys, please tune in. We're going to keep bringing these amazing guests to you guys. My friend Stephanie just jumped in over here on Instagram. Stephanie, how you doing? She's in my heart. That's my spirit girl right there. She's always in my heart. Love her to death. And with that being said, you guys, we're going to catch you guys in the next one. So you guys stay tuned. But always and every time that you go out to the world, just remember that there are people out there that can definitely use your smile, use your words, and we're just walking each other home. We're just walking each other home. Just keep that in mind, okay? And you guys, thank you. It's going to conclude it. You guys have a very great day, and peace.